The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local journalism today at chly.ca/donate. Local news doesn't survive without local support.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. A new tenant protection bylaw is in the works for Nanaimo, but staff are recommending against enhanced protections offered in other BC communities. At a Monday Governance and Priorities Committee meeting, members of Nanaimo City Council were presented with an update on a rental tenant relocation assistance project. Staff are recommending a bylaw that would apply to redevelopments of buildings with 4 or more rental units. The recommendation is to offer displaced tenants 4 months of rent, as well as moving expenses. Some communities in BC with tenant protection bylaws offer people the opportunity to move back into buildings with a rent that is guaranteed at a certain threshold below market levels. While Nanaimo staff recommendations include a right of first refusal, the suggestion is to leave any discount to the discretion of developers. Last year, the City of Victoria implemented a tenant protection bylaw. I reached out to the Victoria Tenants Union for their perspective on the issue.
My name is Harland Bird, and I am a member of the Victoria Tenants Union, which is a grassroots group of tenants that basically focuses on organizing tenants to empower them to protect themselves from landlord exploitation, abuse, and evictions.
And last year, Victoria introduced a tenant protection bylaw. What is your view on that whole issue, on tenant protection bylaws in general?
We were very outspoken about the tenant protection bylaw when it was being discussed and passed in Victoria. And to give you a sense of our attitude towards it, we took to calling it the tenant removal bylaw rather than the tenant protection bylaw.
Can you dive into that more? Explain what you mean there.
I sure can. These are laws that do not really, certainly don't protect tenants. And to the extent that they assist tenants, they do that at a very minimal level. Really, what they are designed to do is to ease tenants out of their homes so that corporate landlords and private developers can cash in. These are laws by people who are operating within the dominant political framework in Canada with regard to housing. This is everybody from Ontario Conservatives to the BC NDP are operating on this philosophy that in order to bring rents and housing prices down, what we need to do is incentivize the quote unquote housing providers, aka the corporate landlords and the private developers, to create more housing. And that, through the laws of supply and demand, will bring down rents and housing prices. But in reality, the interests of the corporate landlords and the private developers are not the same as tenants. In fact, they're irreconcilable. And in fact, you can see this in the recommendations that staff in Nanaimo are putting forward to City Hall. You can see very clearly they've ranked, how good this policy is for tenants and how expensive it is for landlord or, the developers. And you can see the better it is for tenants, the more expensive it is for the developers. And so incentivizing the developers means throwing tenants under the bus. It means weak tenant protections because strong tenant protections are expensive for the quote unquote housing providers.
Well, the main issue these bylaws in communities around BC seems to be meant to address are situations that people would call these days renovictions or demevictions. Either your building is being torn down or renovated on a large scale, and so you aren't going to be able to live there. If these bylaws weren't in place, then protections that you would have as someone living there would be pretty scant. You would maybe get a month's rent. And so my understanding is that these bylaws are meant to at least throw whoever is displaced a bone of a little more rent, a few months' rent instead of one. In some cases, they have the opportunity to maybe move into whatever the renovated building is, maybe even at a reduced from what it would cost to other people rent. When you talk about these as tenant removal bylaws, I'm just wondering about comparing that situation to like the situation where they didn't bother to put a bylaw in place at all and you only got the bare minimum.
That's a fair point. It's better than nothing. I'll say that. But if they were offering nothing, we would see a lot more resistance to people getting kicked out of their homes. And we would see a lot of immediate homelessness. We'd see people getting dragged out and thrown onto the street kind of thing. And so in order to prevent that kind of a situation, yes, they are throwing people a bit of a bone. But we can go through, what the recommendations to staff are, what they're probably going to pass if we look at what other municipalities have. And I can demonstrate that really this is not meaningful assistance, certainly not protection. The first place, compensation, for example, they're offering tenants compensation if their building is being redeveloped and they get kicked out. Again, better than nothing, right? But if you look at the amount of compensation they're getting, it's very, very, very minimal. They're getting some relocation assistance. Again, better than nothing. And I'm assuming that, generally that the city will take up the recommendations of staff, obviously. However, what we've seen in Victoria is that you just can't relocate these people to units that they're going to be paying comparable rent, because obviously rents have skyrocketed in the past 10, 20 years. And so often, if you do manage to successfully relocate them to a unit that's anywhere near the rent that they're paying before they're relocated, it's into a building that is in itself going to be at high risk of a demolition in the near future. And we've seen this in Victoria. Some of the tenants that we've worked with the Victoria Tenants Union have been displaced multiple times into older apartment buildings that then they have to move out of again because they get redeveloped.
Is there anything else you think it's important to bring to the conversation today about tenant protection bylaws, or what you would maybe draft up if you were writing one?
Yeah, if I was writing a tenant protection bylaw, I would put a lot less weight on the recommendations of the developers. And if you can see that, the city staff has done what they call community engagement. Unfortunately, a lot of that includes the private developers who have a very, very strong, keen interest in making sure that these laws don't impact their bottom line. Private developers often do not take on a project unless they are able to make between 16 and 20% profit off of that. So it's a huge profit margin. We need much stronger tenant protections. That means more compensation, a meaningful amount of compensation for these tenants. We need a meaningful right of first refusal that tenants can actually afford to exercise. Again, a discounted rent in the new building that is tied to their current rent before they were displaced, and interim payments to make sure they don't pay extra rent while the new building is being built. And that is, to me, the minimum that we should be doing. If, again, the point of all this redevelopment is not just to make money, but to actually protect tenants in a meaningful sense and to prevent an increase in homelessness. But there's really no substitute for building non-market, publicly built, publicly owned, affordable housing.
Harlan Bird, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me about this.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate you having me on.
Harlan Bird is a member of the Victoria Tenants Union. I also spoke with Lasse Wiedveld of TRAC, the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center.
My name is Lasse. I'm a a legal advocate with TRAC, Tenant Resource and Advisory Center, which is the biggest tenant, at least legal advocacy organization in BC. And I specialize in areas such as additional rent increase for capital expenditures, and I've worked a lot with the City of Vancouver and their plans about the Broadway plan, which are those enhanced tenancy protections that are also concerning today's topic.
And in your view, what are the keys to have a good tenant protection bylaw?
I think the most important is that you end up in a situation where the people who are being evicted or displaced for this development can stay in their community long term, so that they do not have to move out of the areas and lose their community and connections that they have.
So if the goal is for people to be able to stay in the same neighborhood or community, what does the bylaw need to look like to be able to make that happen?
Yeah, so the biggest concern obviously is additional, like a lot of the tenants who will be evicted will be below market rent. So the displacement can happen by them not being able to afford the rent in their neighborhood anymore. So even if there was available units, maybe even next door, if they can't afford them, they will still end up being displaced to less attractive neighborhoods or neighborhoods further out from the city center where where rents will typically be lower. So two sort of core components are the right to come back to your building when it's done, or to your place when it's done, typically preferably at the same rent that you were paying before, or at least a heavily discounted rent. And financial compensation that can sort of carry you over in that period between when you leave your building and your building is done being redeveloped.
You talk there about the ability to potentially move back into a redeveloped building. It's sometimes talked about in these bylaws as right of first refusal. In the Nanaimo example, it hasn't been something that staff have recommended, as at least as far as the right of first refusal with any kind of a discounted rate that's mandated by the bylaw. What do you make of the staff recommendations for a tenant protection bylaw in Nanaimo?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's always a balance between developer affordability, if I'm being kind, and tenant rights. Like because the more financial compensation the developer has to pay to the tenants, the more expensive it becomes for them to develop their property. And I think if we look at the Nanaimo example here, they're significantly more sort of developer friendly than what we see in for example, the City of Vancouver Broadway plan or the City of Burnaby's tenant relocation protection plans. So they're quite heavily in the favor of the developer. If we look sort of like a broad view of sort of the newer tenancy relocation protection plans that we see.
Well, what is your sense of how other tenant protection bylaws in other communities in BC have been performing?
I can't talk about like the effect on like developers' choice to develop. I don't have any insight in that, but how it has been performing in terms of tenants, I think the financial compensation has been overall functioning well. Like for example, the 36 months or now 33 months that you're supposed to be getting under the tenant relocation plan in Vancouver most of the tenants I've worked with has received that amount of money, or in some cases more. The biggest problems we see sort of with the implementations often in these kind of areas is when the tenants are moving back in. There can be a lot of disagreements about what the same rent is. And also, oftentimes, these plans and the city of Nanaimo also doesn't include this, doesn't include like any requirements of like the tenancy agreements specific, like it should be on the same terms or something. They specifically often only care about the rent, which means all the other terms of the contract are up for grabs for the landlord to just tilt them as much as in their favor as they can within the Residential Tenancy Act. And we see like quite a few problems with that often. For example, like let's say you got evicted from a unit where you were allowed to have pets and you had a pet, and now you want to move back in, but the landlord's saying, well, the new agreement is a no pet building. So, that may cause a tenant to not accept their right of first refusal, even if the rent was good. Now the city of Vancouver has said that if they had a pet before, they must be allowed to have a pet. But, this is just an example of like all the kind of little things in like a tenancy agreement that can be changed that can turn out problematic for tenants.
Could you speak to me more about that idea of balance between the impacts of a tenant protection bylaw on people who are renting existing, maybe older spaces, and developers looking to potentially redevelop them?
Yeah. So I mean, I think if we're looking at this document from the city of Nanaimo, right? They have this three cost, right? Cost to the city, cost to the tenant benefit, and then developer financial cost, right? And you can see that most of the ones that really mattered, the city has marked them as high, both in tenant benefit and in developer financial costs, right? There isn't one where like the tenant benefit is high, but the developer financial costs are low. Because generally that's what the tenants need, right? They don't need there isn't a lot of non-cost things that these tenants need to be able to stay in their community, right? They ultimately they need that financial aid. I think it's very important to sort of separate, like the developer profit obviously gets talked about a lot, but I think you should also think about like how does the city profit from this, right? Like the current people who live in the city, if those are not the people who can live in the new buildings, then what are you really doing it for, right? Like the development should be to serve the people of Nanaimo, not people who people who can't, people who would have to come from somewhere else because the locals cannot afford the sort of housing that's being built, especially if you're targeting, the people who need the most financial compensations are the typically low-income tenants, typically in older buildings, exactly the buildings that are being, that often can be the target for redevelopment. So you have this kind of thing where like the buildings that the developers want to redevelop are the ones where the tenants need the most assistance, which is where their extra costs should be the highest. Now, I mean, I think if you look at an overall construction project, you would probably realize pretty soon that these like tenant benefits are not that much money. Even like the Vancouver ones, which are very high, right? I've seen like a landlord pay out to the tenants that were in that area. Maybe they paid out maybe a total around like $1 million in tenant benefits. But the redeveloped property was worth something like $200 million, right? So, and obviously it takes a lot of money to construct that, right? So like in the sense of like the whole math, I haven't seen a case where I felt that like, wow, these tenant benefits are like a significant part of the cost of developing the property.
You've spoken about this a little bit so far, but where would you maybe rank or put the staff recommendations for a tenant protection bylaw in Nanaimo compared to other places in BC?
I think if we talk about any of the newer ones, like let's say tenant relocation protection plans made in the last 5 to 10 years, because there's a lot of really old ones that are really, I think, just made without a real focus on the problems of today's housing crisis and stuff. But if we look at those, then I think Nanaimo's one ranks quite low, right? Like they're suggesting 4 months of compensation versus 33 months in Vancouver, right? So that's almost 10 times less. They don't touch the secondary market at all, which is also with the caveat that I don't know the size of the secondary rental market versus the primary rental market in Nanaimo. That seems to me an odd choice, because like the best type of development is where you maybe take a very low density housing, right? Like 1, 2, 3 houses, and you roll them up. You do a land assembly, and you build an apartment building there. That way, only like 3 homes are put down, and then a lot of apartments are built, right? And you're significantly increasing the housing stock, contra like tearing down like a 20 apartment building of low income tenants to build like a 40 apartment building of low income tenants, right? Like you're only doubling the number of housing, whereas like in the case of those houses, you're maybe like 10 timesing or even more the number of housing units, right? So the secondary market, I would say, is an important aspect, and I think generally has been an important aspect in these cases. And to not give those tenants any sort of protections, I think, is also quite uncommon. For sure, Vancouver has the secondary market included as well, and I think a lot of tenants who are in the situation where like they're living in the basement suite, maybe there's 2 suites upstairs, you got a 3-floor house of tenants on each floor, right? That would be 3 units in a building that wouldn't be covered by the Nanaimo development plan. So and a lot of those suites are like really affordable. That there's a lot of affordability in that third market. So I think that's also a big miss in the Nanaimo plan contra the others. And then, of course, the last one, as you said, the a right of first refusal, as it's so called here in the Nanaimo plan, right? They don't recommend the discount or like that you can come back at the old rent, which means in reality you often won't be able to come back.
So this bylaw doesn't exist yet. It's in the process maybe now of being drafted, with it being envisaged to maybe be adopted in July. Between now and then, do you think there's anything it's important for maybe the folks on City Council in Nanaimo to take into account or think about as they work through this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to think about, first of all, what do you want to happen, right? Do you want to have single family houses rolled up and built into higher density housing? Because if you want, then if that's what you prefer to happen, then this bylaw doesn't protect any of the tenants in those single family houses on my reading. So you would need to change that, right? If that's what you want. Now, if you wanted to target already like medium-sized rental buildings and make them even taller, even higher, I think you would need to consider a couple of things. One, you're probably displacing a lot of tenants. So is there actually available housing in the area at all? If you like, let's say, develop, a 40-unit tenant building into like a very tall building with, let's say, 120 units. Like, are there places those 40 tenants can go, especially if it happens to like multiple mid-size apartments at the same time? And also, if you're choosing that route, are you just basically getting rid of your only affordable rental housing? Because usually the old rental buildings are the most affordable rental housing, and if you're replacing them specifically with like new build units and no one can come back at their old rent, then that's a very gentrifying process, right? You're sort of like changing the character of the neighborhood, and you're also, even though your development is supposed to solve the housing crisis, like provide more housing, the people who actually need the housing won't be able to get it. So you might even end up making the problem worse.
Is there anything else you think it's important to bring to the conversation today on this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the 4 months is very, very low. I think if I would I would take a hard look at like, okay, who are the people we are thinking are being impacted by this? What are they currently paying in rent? How long, if they had to rent at market prices now, how long would 4 months rent as compensation last them? Like, how long could they afford to stay in the community by getting 4 months rent up front? And I think the answer would be less than a year, probably. So that would be a pretty, yeah. So I think that is what I would seriously take a look at, whether that financial compensation is at all adequate, or whether it's just like delaying the inevitable by like 2 to 6 months.
Lasse Wiedwell is a legal advocate with the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center.
Midcoast Morning is part of our nonprofit newsroom project, supported by listeners like you. Keep this program on the air by funding it today with a monthly sustaining donation at chly.ca/donate. We've got tote bags and shirts if you need an incentive.
We're talking about a planned tenant protection bylaw that's in the works in Nanaimo. It was one of the topics covered at a recent Governance and Priorities Committee meeting. Staff are recommending a bylaw that would offer people displaced by redevelopment compensation in the form of 4 months of rent plus moving expenses. The bylaw is expected to apply only to situations where 4 or more existing rental units are part of a redevelopment. It is forecast to come before council in July. I spoke with a member of the city's planning department about the planned bylaw.
Hi, my name is Christine Mays. I'm a planner 2 here at the City of Nanaimo, working with the community planning team.
What's the ultimate goal of this tenant protection bylaw that's expected to come before Nanaimo City Council next month?
So the objective of the the rental tenant relocation assistance project. So the intent is to address city plan policies as well as the integrated action plan priorities. And so that is to create a tenant protection plan. So what's happened in the last couple of years is the province passed Bill 16, so that was in 2024, and that allows us to create a tenant protection bylaw, and that is the authority that we were trying to explore through this project.
And could you tell me what kind of community consultation went into the recommendations for a tenant protection bylaw?
Absolutely. So we did a couple of different focus group or interest group presentations. So that was with the Advisory Committee on Accessibility and Inclusiveness. So that was in November of last year. And then earlier this year, we kicked it off with a couple of different groups. So that was our tenant and our housing advocacy groups, as well as the developer community and rental building owner community. So those are the different groups that we reached out to.
And it's my understanding that this is forecast to apply only to situations where there would be 4 or more rental units impacted. Is that correct?
Correct, yes. So it's for a building that's got 4 or more rental units. That's the approach that council has given the green light on. And the intent of that is to capture just buildings on their own. So anything that 5 or more. It's a lot of these older rental buildings tend to have that sort of unit composition.
Was there any consideration given to potentially having this also apply to situations where maybe like a single family home that has a suite in the basement or something is being redeveloped into like a mid-sized apartment to give people who might be renting in some of those smaller like suite situations some kind of tenant protection?
Yeah, so we did provide a couple of different options in our staff report to the Governance and Priorities Committee, and we looked at secondary rentals. So that tends to be the type of unit composition that you're looking for. Could be a house suite, etc. And then there's also opportunities to explore, such as the City of Victoria that does any loss of a rental for redevelopment. In this particular case, our city plan, specifies that it's 4 or more. So that is the direction that we went with.
Do you have a sense of how often these redevelopments on buildings with 4 or more rental units are happening in Nanaimo right now?
Yeah, we did take a look. So since 2022, there was 6 developments that we identified that had rental buildings with 4 or more. And that comprised of about 140 units.
When you looked at what other municipalities in BC had done on this file, how did that inform your recommendations to council on what to do in a potential bylaw?
Yeah, so in total, there's sort of 8 that are currently either they've been adopted or they're in process throughout the province. 6 of them have been adopted. 2 are, going through that legislative process. And, we took a look at all of them. I guess, one of the differences for Nanaimo is we didn't have a pre-existing tenant relocation policy, which is what a lot of cities tend to have before these new powers were provided by the province. And so we took a look at the different scales. So, we look at sort of population, what were they proposing in their tenant protection bylaws. And so, we really tried to find some commonalities and find things that really fit the Nanaimo context.
When you say fit the Nanaimo context, what does that mean?
Yeah, so, typically, I guess, what we're looking for is the framework of a bylaw. And so the GPC report was sort of broken up in that, how many units does it apply to? What sort of requirements would the owner have for providing reports to the city or communications to tenants? Another being, your financial compensation. So, how much compensation is provided? Is it a flat fee? Is it, based on a sliding scale, depending on how long you've been in the building? Exemptions as well, if there's any opportunity for that, as well as enforcement mechanisms. We also took a look at a couple of other approaches, which we called enhanced approaches in the report. And that included, relocation assistance. So that's your owner finding other types of units to move people back into, as well as additional supports for vulnerable tenants and right of first refusal. And so, we took a look through, we had some great consultants who did a couple of reports for us. So we did a best practices review for other municipalities who either had a bylaw, who had policies, or were sort of working towards a bylaw. And we also did a financial feasibility analysis, so one in December of 2025. And then we published one with a couple of the metrics that we were hoping to use. And all those sort of brought together the recommendations that we brought forward to the committee.
And for the most part, my understanding is that in your recommendations, you suggested against a number of those enhanced measures, things like right of first refusal for tenants to be able to return at some kind of discounted rate to the redeveloped building, or imposing some kind of obligation on the landlord to find someone a new place to live. Could you talk to me about why your decision not to recommend some of those things, some of which other municipalities like, say, Victoria have gone within their bylaws?
Yeah, and a lot of it sort of came down to, our financial feasibility analysis, and even a review of best practices sort of showed, cities of, different sizes sort of went different routes. With us, not having a policy to sort of rely on and to see how that would work. We recognized that there was a lot of financial constraints for owners, and also, understanding that, what would that mean for sort of staff time. And, we've left it in an approach, recognizing we're probably not going to see, redevelopment to the scale that a lot of cities are, and that we have an opportunity to take something forward, see how it works, potentially bring it back at a future time. So really monitor effectiveness of the bylaw as it is. This particular bylaw is very similar to Kelowna's bylaw. That didn't include, the right of first refusal or the relocation assistance or additional supports. So that's a really good sort of base bylaw that we took a look at.
I spoke with a legal advocate from TRAC, the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center, who suggested that looking over the staff recommendations in Nanaimo, it would make for a bylaw that, compared to the kind of spectrum of bylaws out there in BC, would be more heavily in favor of the interests of developers as opposed to tenants, compared to a number of the other bylaws out there in other BC municipalities. How would you respond to that kind of suggestion?
Yeah, the financial feasibility analysis was, a really great indicator for us to understand, sort of what the limits of a bylaw could really be, and just, taking a look at the market as is. That in itself sort of provided some guidance as to, where the 4 months was. And we really tried to include provisions in there to, again, bring not only just the rental rate of what people are paying now, which is sort of what the protection is under the Residential Tenancy Act, but to bring it closer to a CMHC average for people who are potentially paying less than, those rates. So, that's kind of where we came, from was, again, that financial feasibility analysis. And then also too is just, the economic challenge of redeveloping those apartment buildings. Our typical redevelopment is those 6 stories. So, city plan policy supports a lot of redevelopment. But, to the extent of understanding, that it remains economically challenging at the current time.
What is maybe the goal of city plans supporting some of the redevelopment of those apartment buildings ultimately? Like, if there's a balance here between the redevelopment community and the tenants who already live in the existing buildings, I think it's fairly easy for people to identify with the situation of the tenants who are like losing their housing and will need to find somewhere new to live, and presumably it will be hard for them to find somewhere with anywhere close to the same market rent. What is on the other end of that balance? What is the thing you're needing to protect against on kind of the developer end?
Well, and, I guess one of the options that we sort of put forward and councils supported is, an opportunity to exempt, owners from paying, I guess, the full compensation where we have, where they're replacing the unit for a certain percentage over what the current rent is of a unit. So we're trying to provide some incentives to be able to move people, lower that, potential uncertainty for finding units. So, I think we really heard through the renter survey that we held in, I think, mostly January and February of this year, that, people really felt that financial support was extremely important. And so it was, really important to really, take those comments that we heard from the public and, incorporate those into the recommendations that we provided to the committee.
My understanding on the next steps on this is that city staff are going to be working on drafting a bylaw that's expected to be presented to council in July. And then if all goes smoothly and council votes in favor of it, it could also be adopted at a later meeting also this July. Is that a correct understanding of the timeline?
Yeah, that's certainly a hope. It's a bit of a condensed timeline, just because our last meeting for this particular session is going to be the 27th of July. If not then, it would potentially be mid-September. So it gives us a bit of an opportunity to build communication materials and make sure we have that all ready once the bylaw is adopted.
Is there anything else you think it's important to bring to the conversation today on this issue?
Yeah, I think it's great to have, council had some great conversation yesterday. The committee had great conversation, really taking sort of that streamlined approach, may work for the city context now. And it's always an opportunity to be able to, in the future time, revisit. The staff report really laid out sort of our key challenges, identified some great alternatives. So, this work will continue to exist in the realm that, we can take a look back on it.
Christine Mays, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me about this.
Thank you.
Christine Mays is a planner with the City of Nanaimo. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, you can email us at news@chly.ca. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.